On the surface, Willow Creek, Georgia, looked like one of those towns that belonged on a postcard. Rows of neat brick houses sat under towering oak trees. Every Sunday morning, the bells of St. Matthew's Church echoed across quiet streets. Folks waved at each other from porches, neighbors swapped pies, and kids rode bikes past a white-painted courthouse that stood like the town's heart. To outsiders, it looked like nothing bad could ever happen here. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, shadows always lingered. And no one embodied that tension more than Sheriff Richard Hayes. Richard was the kind of man people whispered about with pride. Broad-shouldered, 6 feet tall, his uniform always pressed sharp, badge gleaming under the southern sun. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been born to lead. At parades, he walked in front, waving to crowds. At church, he sat tall in the front pew. Mothers pointed him out to their children. That's our sheriff. That's the man who keeps us safe. And to most, Richard Hayes played the part perfectly. He was firm, but fair. He knew everyone's name, from the pastor to the gas station clerk. He broke up fights at the bar before they turned ugly, and when storms ripped through town, he was the one driving from house to house, checking on the elderly. To Willow Creek, he was more than just a sheriff. He was the face of their values, the embodiment of what they believed a Southern man should be: strong, disciplined, a protector. But behind that polished image, Richard lived with contradictions. He was a man of power who craved control, yet inside he carried insecurities that gnawed at him in silence. His temper was quick, his pride sharper than any blade. And when he felt disrespected, that pride burned hotter than fire. At the town diner, folks often gathered over coffee and biscuits, talking about him. "Sheriff Hayes is a good man," one old farmer would say, shaking his head approvingly. "Wouldn't want to cross him, though," another would mutter. There was admiration in their voices, but fear too. On certain evenings, when the diner windows glowed with neon light and the jukebox played softly in the background, Richard would walk in, nodding at familiar faces. He ordered black coffee, rarely smiling, but his eyes, those restless eyes, always seemed to drift toward Clarissa Monroe, the woman who would one day become his wife. Clarissa was different from the other women in town. Graceful, magnetic, with a laugh that carried across a room. She wore bright dresses that seemed to light up the dim corners of the diner. People said she had an aura about her, something that drew men in and left women whispering. When she and Richard first began appearing together, it sent tongues wagging. The town's golden lawman and the town's most alluring beauty. It looked like a match made in heaven. For Richard, Clarissa was more than just a companion. She was a prize, proof that he could have the most desirable woman in Willow Creek at his side. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect couple. He, the strong, principled sheriff. She, the beautiful, loyal wife. Together, they looked like something out of a Southern romance novel. But appearances in Willow Creek mattered more than truth. And no one knew that better than Clarissa. Beneath her charm, she carried a secret, one so fragile and dangerous that she guarded it with her life. She had always dreamed of living openly as the woman she knew she was. And in Willow Creek, she thought she had finally found that chance. But she also knew that the truth could destroy everything she had built. Richard, on the other hand, didn't see Clarissa's heart as clearly as he should have. To him, love wasn't about tenderness. It was about possession, about image, about control. He saw in Clarissa not just a woman, but a mirror of his own status. And in a town where gossip spread faster than wildfire, the thought of losing face terrified him more than death itself. The people of Willow Creek never suspected the storm that was building. To them, Sheriff Hayes remained untouchable, a man who stood above the law he enforced. But as every true crime story teaches us, the mask always cracks. No matter how carefully someone plays their role, the truth waits in silence, waiting for one moment, one spark, to tear the illusion apart. That moment was closer than anyone realized. When Richard and Clarissa first appeared together as a couple, Willow Creek practically buzzed with excitement. For weeks, it was all anyone could talk about. The sheriff, the very man who represented the law and order of their little town, had finally chosen a woman to stand at his side. And not just any woman. Clarissa Monroe, whose beauty had long been the subject of whispered conversations. Their courtship seemed like a whirlwind. Richard was seen escorting her to church on Sundays, his arm proudly around her waist. They were spotted leaving the movie theater, laughing in the glow of the marquee. When Clarissa moved into Richard's home, the town interpreted it as a natural next step. Folks admired how they looked together, her elegance softening his stern presence. But inside their home, the picture was not quite as perfect. Richard was a man used to authority. His badge didn't come off at the front door, and he expected Clarissa to understand that. He wanted the meals prepared, the house spotless, his desires met without question. Clarissa, eager to keep peace, often complied. She told herself this was what love required: compromise, patience, endurance. And yet, there were moments that made her doubt. Nights when Richard came home late, smelling of whiskey, his voice sharper than usual. Times when she caught a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, as if he was measuring her against some unspoken standard. Those moments tightened the knot of fear in her chest. Because Clarissa lived with a secret, one so carefully buried she had convinced herself it might never surface. Long before Willow Creek, before the sheriff's badge and the southern porch swings, she had fought a battle most in town couldn't imagine. She had been born into a body that didn't match who she truly was. For years, she endured ridicule, rejection, and loneliness. But she also endured surgeries, paperwork, and the long, exhausting fight to live openly as Clarissa, the woman she always knew herself to be. By the time she arrived in Willow Creek, she had become the woman she wanted to show the world. Confident, radiant, full of life, she believed the past was behind her, that she could finally live without fear. But even as she smiled at neighbors and charmed Richard's colleagues, the secret pressed at the edges of her mind. She knew what could happen if it ever came out. She had seen enough hate in her life to know that not everyone would accept her truth. Richard never asked questions about her past. He wasn't the kind of man who dwelled on details. As long as Clarissa played her role, as long as she looked the part of the sheriff's wife, he seemed content. Still, Clarissa noticed the cracks in his affection. He rarely spoke of love. He spoke of loyalty, of appearances, of how people looked at them when they walked into church. For Richard, she began to realize their marriage was less about intimacy and more about image. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Clarissa tried to open her heart. "Richard," she said softly, her fork untouched on the plate, "do you ever think about what brought us together? About whether this is really love?" Richard didn't look up from his food. "You're my wife. That's all that matters." She swallowed, her chest tightening. "But do you love me?" Finally, he raised his eyes. There was something cold in them, something that made her stomach twist. "Clarissa, don't go digging where you don't need to. You're mine. You understand?" The words hung heavy in the air. Clarissa lowered her gaze, hiding the pain in her eyes. She knew she couldn't risk pushing him further. He wasn't a man who liked questions, especially ones that threatened the illusion he held so tightly. Over time, Clarissa began to live a double life within her own marriage. To Richard in the town, she was a devoted wife, always dressed perfectly, always at his side when needed. But in private moments, when Richard was away, she let her guard down. She kept journals filled with thoughts she dared not speak aloud. Pages about her fear of discovery, her longing to be accepted fully, her worry that Richard's pride would never allow him to understand. What Clarissa couldn't know was how close those fears were to becoming reality. Richard's temper, his obsession with control, his deep-rooted fear of humiliation. Those forces were like dry timber, waiting for a single spark. And though neither of them could see it yet, that spark was already smoldering, hidden in the secret Clarissa fought so hard to protect. To the people of Willow Creek, theirs was a marriage that looked enviable from the outside. But behind closed doors, love was tangled with fear, and devotion carried the weight of silence. It was a fragile balance, one that could not last forever. It was late on a Friday night, when Sheriff Richard Hayes pulled his cruiser into the driveway of the little brick house he shared with Clarissa. The street was quiet, porch lights glowing softly, crickets filling the humid Georgia air. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the house. He had been drinking again. Not enough to stumble, but enough that the warmth of bourbon smoldered in his veins. He wasn't coming home for conversation or tenderness. He was coming for what he felt was his due. In Richard's mind, Clarissa was his wife, his possession, and when he wanted her, she had no right to deny him. He cut the engine, slammed the door, and walked up the path with heavy steps. Inside, Clarissa had been preparing for the evening. She lit candles, placed a record on the turntable. Something soft, old jazz humming low in the background. She poured 2 glasses of red wine, trying to create an atmosphere of warmth, maybe even romance. There had been too many nights of tension lately, too many sharp words and long silences. Tonight, she wanted to soften him, to remind him of the love she believed could still exist between them. When Richard walked in, she greeted him with a smile, though her eyes revealed a trace of caution. "You're home," she said, taking his coat. "I poured you a glass." Richard looked at the candles, the wine, the record spinning. For a moment, his expression softened, but as he sipped, his gaze darkened again. "You always know how to set a mood," he muttered, lowering himself into the chair. "But let's not pretend. We both know what I came for." Clarissa swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep calm. She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Richard, sometimes I just wish we could talk. About us. About how we feel." He yanked his hand back, jaw tightening. "Feelings? Talking? That's not what I need tonight." She stood quietly, then nodded. She had learned not to push too far. They moved into bedroom, candles flickering shadows across the walls. Clarissa tried to steady her breathing, to remind herself that she loved this man, or at least loved who she thought he was. But that night faded other plans. As Richard drew closer, something shifted. A moment of intimacy turned into a moment of revelation. He noticed a scar he had never questioned before, details in her body that didn't fit his rigid understanding of what a woman should be. Confusion spread across his face, quickly twisting into rage. He pulled back sharply, eyes wide. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. Clarissa froze, her heart thundering in her chest. "Richard, please, let me explain." "Explain." His voice rose, sharp and violent. I'm your wife. I'm the woman who's loved you from the start. Nothing about that has ever been a lie." He staggered backward, as if the very air betrayed him. His face flushed red, veins bulging at his temples. You tricked me. You made me a damn fool in front of everyone. Sheriff Hayes, protector of the town, married to this?" His voice cracked, venom dripping with every syllable. Tears filled Clarissa's eyes. She stepped forward, trembling. "Richard, I never wanted to hurt you. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of losing everything. But I am Clarissa. I've always been Clarissa." "Shut up," he roared, his hand shaking. "Do you know what this would do to me if people found out? To my name, my badge, my reputation? You've ruined me." "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "I want to protect us. To protect you. Please listen to me." But Richard wasn't listening. His pride, his fear, his anger, they consumed him like wildfire. In his mind, he wasn't just betrayed by Clarissa. He was humiliated, mocked, stripped of the image he had built his entire life upon. His hand went to his hip, where his service revolver hung heavy in its holster. Clarissa's eyes widened in horror. "Richard, please don't." He drew the weapon, the metallic click slicing through the air. For a fleeting second his face softened, as if wrestling with doubt. But then rage won. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice almost trembling. "And for that, I can't forgive you." The gunshot exploded, deafening in the small bedroom. Clarissa's body jolted. Her breath caught in her throat as the crimson spread across her dress. She collapsed to the floor, candles flickering wildly as the record kept spinning. The music suddenly grotesque against the sound of death. As her body gave way, Clarissa's mind clung desperately to fragment of her life. The nights of laughter with friends, the soft hum of jazz records, the simple dream of being loved without fear. Her eyes, glassy with tears, searched Richard's face one last time. "I only wanted to live as myself," she whispered, her lips trembling, "and to be your wife." A single breath escaped her, carrying both sorrow and love, before silence claimed her. Clarissa's knees buckled as her breath shortened. She could feel the warmth of blood spreading, but her mind refused to let go. In that final moment, she looked up at Richard, her lips trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "I was never your enemy, Richard. I only ever wanted to love you. I only ever wanted to be your wife." A single tear slid down her cheek before her eyes dimmed, leaving a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air from the room. Richard stood frozen, the gun still smoking in his hand. His chest heaved, his eyes locked on the woman who had been his wife, the woman he claimed had shamed him. The room smelled of gunpowder and blood. For a long moment, silence filled the house, broken only by the scratch of the record needle. Richard's hands trembled, the revolver clattering to the floor. He dropped to his knees beside her, staring at her lifeless face. "What did you make me do?" he whispered hoarsely. "God, help me! What did you make me do?" Outside, the neighbors stirred. The gunshot had shattered the stillness of the night. Lights flicked on across the street. Curtains parted. A dog barked. Someone shouted, "Did you hear that?" Another voice called. It came from the sheriff's place. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, rushing toward the house. Richard remained kneeling, hands and shirt stained with blood. The sheriff, the man everyone trusted, had just crossed a line he could never step back from. The perfect marriage was over. The secret was out. And in the town of Willow Creek, nothing would ever be the same again. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air when the first sirens echoed down Maplewood Lane. Red and blue lights splashed across the quiet Georgia Street, painting the brick houses in harsh, surreal colors. Neighbors who had once spoken of Richard Hayes with reverence now stood barefoot on their porches in shock, whispering to one another as patrol cars skidded to a stop outside the sheriff's own home. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. The flickering candles that Clarissa had lit hours earlier cast grotesque shadows across the walls. The record player still spun, its soft jazz turning eerie, like a cruel soundtrack to death. On the floor, Clarissa's body lay sprawled near the bed, her dress darkened with blood. Richard knelt beside her, hands stained red, his face blank, as though the man who had once stood tall in parades and on courthouse steps had been hollowed out in an instant. The door burst open. Deputy Carl Benson, one of Richard's most trusted men, rushed inside with his weapon drawn. But the sight before him made him stop cold. "Sheriff," he whispered, disbelief coating the single word. Richard looked up slowly, his eyes bloodshot, his expression a mix of fury and despair. "She lied to me, Carl," he muttered. "She wasn't who she said she was." Carl's hands shook as he lowered his gun. Behind him, more officers filed in, their boots echoing against the hardwood floor. None of them had ever imagined their first crime scene inside the sheriff's home. Carl's throat tightened as he lowered his gun. This was the man who had mentored him, the man who taught him how to stand tall in uniform, the man he once called a hero. Now Richard sat slumped on the floor, covered in blood, his revolver lying useless at his side. "God help us," Carl whispered, his voice breaking. "You were the one we all looked up to." For the first time since he pinned on his badge, Carl felt the ground shift beneath him. If the sheriff could fall, if the law itself could shatter in a single night, then nothing in Willow Creek was as safe or certain as it once seemed. Outside, the crowd of neighbors grew. Some clutched their robes tighter against the humid night air. Others held their children close, shielding them from the chaos. Whispers rippled to the gathering like wildfire. Was that a gunshot? They say it came from inside the Hayes house. Dear Lord, don't tell me he shot Clarissa. One woman covered her mouth with trembling hands. She was always so kind, always smiling. How could this happen? Back inside, paramedics pushed through, but one look at Clarissa told them there was nothing left to save. The lead medic shook his head gravely. Time of death, 11:42 p.m., he said quietly, scribbling on his clipboard. Richard's breathing grew ragged. His voice rose, almost desperate. "You don't understand. She tricked me. She fooled all of us." His words echoed off the walls, but they didn't sound like the voice of a lawman anymore. They sounded like the ramblings of a broken man. Detective Marcus Hill arrived shortly after, his trench coat billowing as he stepped through the doorway. A seasoned investigator with decades under his belt, Hill was no stranger to blood. But what froze him was the identity of the killer. A sheriff, the very man sworn to uphold the law. He crouched near Clarissa's body, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. Then he looked up at Richard, who sat slumped against the wall, gun lying discarded on the floor. "Richard," Marcus said steadily, "tell me exactly what happened." Richard shook his head violently, sweat dripping down his temples. "She lied. She wasn't a woman. Not really. She humiliated me." His voice cracked. I couldn't let the town know." Marcus stood slowly, his gaze hardening. "You killed your wife, Sheriff. That's what the town's going to know." Outside, reporters had already begun to arrive, drawn by the police scanners and the sight of flashing lights at the sheriff's house. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust forward, voices clamoring. "Sheriff Hayes, why did you shoot your wife? Is it true she was hiding something from you? Is this the end of your career?" The chaos only deepened the shock that gripped Willow Creek. For years, Richard Hayes had been their shield, their protector. Now he was their headline. Deputies exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. Some had grown up idolizing Richard. Others owed their careers to him. And now they were the ones cuffing his wrists, reading him his rights, leading him through the very front yard where he had once shaken hands with neighbors and kissed babies during election season. As Richard was escorted out, the crowd gasped. Some shouted angrily, "Murderer!" "You're supposed to protect us, not kill." Others stood silent, tears glistening in their eyes. In that moment, the town fractured. Some clung to the belief that Richard must have snapped under betrayal, that he was a good man pushed too far. Others saw nothing but hypocrisy, a lawman who had turned into the very kind of criminal he claimed to protect them from. Back inside the house, Marcus lingered alone for a moment. He studied Clarissa's body, her face now still, serene even in death. He thought of how the community had embraced her smile, yet how she must have lived in fear, carrying her secret day after day. She deserved better, he whispered to no one in particular. Much better. As dawn approached, the candles in the bedroom burned down to nothing, leaving only smoke trails in the air. The record player had stopped, the needle stuck in silence. And Willow Creek, a town once so proud of its sheriff, awoke to the truth that would haunt them for years to come. That no one, not even the man in uniform, was above the darkness of his own pride. Detective Marcus Hill didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the house on Maplewood Lane had become less a home and more a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the humid breeze, and crime scene technicians filed in and out, photographing every corner, every bloodstain, every shadow. Clarissa's body had been taken to the coroner's office, but her presence lingered. The flicker of candles, the shattered wine glass, the blood pooled on polished hardwood. These were the remains of a night that had ripped apart more than one life. Richard Hayes sat in an interrogation room at the Willow Creek police station. For the first time in years, he wasn't behind the badge. He was behind cold metal walls, a suspect like any other. His uniform had been stripped away, replaced by the plain clothes he had worn that night, now stained with his wife's blood. His hands shook as he rubbed his temples. Detective Hill entered, dropping a file onto the table. His gaze was sharp, unflinching. "Richard," he began, his voice low but firm, "you've served this town for over a decade. People trusted you. They looked up to you. And now your wife is dead. You need to tell me why." Richard's eyes darted to the file, then back to Marcus. "She lied to me. For 15 years, she kept the truth from me. She wasn't who she claimed to be." Marcus leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "She was your wife. That's who she was. You put a bullet in her chest, Richard. A woman who loved you. That's the truth that matters here." Richard slammed his fist against the table, voice cracking. "You don't get it. I'm Sheriff Hayes. My name means something. My badge means something. If people found out, if they knew I'd been married to someone like her, I'd be ruined." Marcus didn't flinch. "And now you're ruined anyway. Except this time, you're not a man with a secret. You're a man facing life in prison. Meanwhile, the coroner's office released their initial report. Clarissa Monroe had been shot at close range, the bullet piercing her chest and stopping her heart instantly. More details began to emerge. Yes, she was a transgender woman, and yes, she had kept that part of her past hidden. The revelation sparked shockwaves, not only through Willow Creek, but across Georgia. Local news channels led with headlines that stunned viewers. Sheriff shoots wife after discovering she was transgender. Betrayal or hate crime. Town reels after shocking murder. Within hours, the story spread beyond state lines. Reporters descended on the small town, their cameras crowding the courthouse steps, their microphones reaching for any soundbite. Some painted Richard as a betrayed husband who had snapped. Others condemned him outright, calling it an execution driven by pride and prejudice. In diners and barbershops, conversations grew heated. He's been our sheriff for years. One man argued over his morning coffee. He kept us safe. You can't judge him for one bad night. Another slammed his mug on the counter. One bad night? He murdered his wife in cold blood. That ain't mistake. That's who he is. The town was split down the middle. Some defended Richard, insisting that Clarissa's secrecy had pushed him beyond reason. Others mourned her, pointing out that fear had forced her silence, that she had lived every day terrified of exactly this outcome. The next morning, the diner was packed tighter than it had been in years. The smell of bacon and coffee hung heavy, but conversation drowned out the clatter of dishes. Richard Hayes was betrayed, one man shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. Any man in his shoes would have snapped the same way. Across the room, a woman's voice cut sharp as a knife. Snapped? He murdered her. Betrayal doesn't give you the right to put a bullet in your wife's chest. The argument rippled, voices overlapping, chairs scraping. Some defended Richard as a man broken by deception. Others rose in fury, defending Clarissa, pointing out her kindness and her constant fear of not being accepted. The waitress, usually cheerful, stood frozen with a coffee pot in hand, her eyes wide with tears. She had served both Richard and Clarissa countless times, and now her diner had become the battleground for a town tearing itself in half. Detective Hill refused to let public opinion sway him. He built the case brick by brick, collecting ballistic evidence, witness statements, and the coroner's full report. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Richard Hayes had killed Clarissa not in self-defense, not in an uncontrollable frenzy, but in cold blood fueled by rage. When Marcus returned to the interrogation room with the file in hand, he dropped it harder this time. "This isn't about your badge anymore," he said. "This is about justice. And justice says you pulled that trigger because your pride couldn't handle the truth." Richard lowered his head into his hands, his voice breaking into a whisper. "I couldn't let them laugh at me. Not the men at the diner. Not the folks at church. Not the town I swore to protect." Marcus stared at him, the weight of the moment pressing down. "And now, they're not laughing, Richard. They're horrified. You didn't protect this town. You tore it apart." Outside the station, Clarissa's friends gathered, holding candles in her memory. They wept as they spoke of her kindness, her laughter, her quiet resilience. One woman clutched a photo of Clarissa and whispered, "She only ever wanted to be loved. That's all. And for that, she died." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Willow Creek was no longer the town it had been just 24 hours before. Its sheriff was in handcuffs, its people were divided, and its most radiant woman had been silenced forever. For Detective Marcus Hill, the case was just beginning, but for the community, the reckoning had already arrived. The courthouse in Willow Creek had never seen such a crowd. On the morning of Richard Hayes' trial, the line to get inside stretched down the steps and spilled onto the street. Reporters set up cameras on the lawn, broadcasting live updates as curious townsfolk craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the fallen sheriff. Inside, the air was electric with tension. Every pew of the gallery was filled. Clarissa's friend sat in the front rows, clutching tissues and photographs of her smiling face. On the other side, Richard's supporters whispered prayers, hoping the man they once idolized to be spared the harshest judgment. When Richard was led into the courtroom, Shackled and dressed in a plain gray suit, a wave of murmurs swept through the room. He no longer looked like the confident sheriff who had led parades and commanded respect. His shoulders were hunched, his hair unkempt, his face pale. Judge Morrison, a stern man with steel gray hair, presided over the trial. His gavel struck hard, silencing the murmurs. Court is now in session. The people of the state versus Richard Hayes. The prosecutor, Paul Harrington, rose first. Tall, composed, his dark suit pressed as sharply as his words, he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear a story of pride, of betrayal, and of rage. But at the heart of this case lies a woman named Clarissa Monroe, a woman who wanted nothing more than to live as herself, to be loved, to be safe in her own home. And it was her husband, the man sworn to protect this community, who took her life in cold blood. This was not an accident. This was not a crime of passion. This was murder. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle before continuing. The defendant will claim shock, humiliation, betrayal. But the law does not bend for wounded pride. The law demands accountability. And by the end of this trial, you will see that Richard Hayes is guilty of murder in the first degree. Richard's defense attorney, Linda Parker, stood next. A sharp, silver-streaked woman with the poise of a veteran litigator. She faced the jury with practiced calm. My client, Sheriff Hayes, is not a monster. He is a man who devoted his life to this town, who protected its people for over a decade. He was blindsided by a deception so profound it shook the very foundation of his marriage. On the night in question, he acted not out of hatred, but out of shock, out of human weakness. And while we do not excuse his actions, we ask you to understand the depth of the betrayal he experienced. The jury shifted uneasily. From the start, the case was not just about murder. It was about identity, pride, and the values of a small southern town forced to face truths it had long ignored. Detective Marcus Hill was the prosecution's star witness. Taking the stand, he recounted the night he walked into the sheriff's home to find Clarissa lifeless on the floor. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of what he had seen. Sheriff Hayes told me she lied to him, Marcus said. That was his reason. Not fear for his safety, not self-defense, but humiliation. He cared more about his pride than her life. Paul Harrington leaned closer. Detective, in your experience, does that sound like a man who lost control or a man making excuses? Marcus didn't hesitate. It sounded like a man who couldn't stand being laughed at, and he chose to silence the only person who knew his secret. The defense called Richard himself to the stand, a gamble, but one they believed necessary. The courtroom held its breath as he walked to the witness box, chains clinking softly at his ankles. Richard's voice was low at first, almost trembling. I loved her, he began. I did, but when I found out the truth, it was like my whole world shattered. 15 years, and I never knew. I felt fooled, like the town's respect, my entire identity, was built on a lie. Linda Parker guided him carefully. Richard, did you intend to kill your wife when you walked into that room? He shook his head, tears brimming. No. God, no. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't myself. But under cross-examination, the prosecution tore into him. Paul Harrington's voice was sharp as a blade. Sheriff Hayes, you carry a gun every day for years. You knew what pulling that trigger meant. Don't tell this court you didn't know what you were doing. Richard's face tightened. I wasn't thinking. You weren't thinking, or you didn't want to face the laughter, the whispers at church, at the diner, from the very people you claim to protect. Harrington's words thundered through the courtroom. Isn't the truth that you killed Clarissa Monroe not because she lied, but because you couldn't bear what her truth meant for your reputation? The room fell silent. Richard's lips parted, but no words came. His silence was louder than any confession. Witness after witness painted a picture of Clarissa as a kind, generous woman who lived in quiet fear. Friends testified about how she had once admitted she didn't feel safe telling Richard everything. One recalled her saying, "If he ever found out, I don't know what he'd do." By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was heavy with grief. Paul Harrington's voice rang like a verdict before the verdict itself. This was not just a crime against Clarissa. It was a crime against every value this badge is supposed to stand for: law, justice, protection. Richard Hayes betrayed them all when he put a bullet in his wife's chest. Don't let pride excuse murder. Don't let a uniform excuse blood. Give Clarissa the justice she never got in life. Linda Parker made her final plea, her voice softer, almost imploring. Sheriff Hayes is guilty of making a terrible mistake, but he is not guilty of premeditated murder. He is guilty of being human, of failing under the weight of a secret he was never prepared for. Do not let grief blind you to mercy. The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom in tense silence. Hours stretched like days. Clarissa's friends wept softly, clutching hands. Richard sat motionless, staring at the floor. When the jury returned, every eye in the room fixed on them. The foreman stood, his voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Hayes, guilty of murder in the first degree. The gasp that followed shook the rafters. Richard's knees buckled as deputies moved to restrain him. Clarissa's friends cried openly, some whispering prayers of thanks. Judge Morrison's gavel struck. Richard Hayes, you've been found guilty. Sentencing will follow. This court is adjourned. As Richard was led away in chains, the cameras outside captured the moment that would forever define Willow Creek. The sheriff who once symbolized law and order had been condemned as a murderer. And for the first time since that night of blood and gunpowder, Clarissa's memory had a voice in the halls of justice. The verdict had landed like a thunderclap. Guilty, first-degree murder. For a man like Richard Hayes, who had built his entire life on the illusion of respect and power, the word cut deeper than any bullet. Days later, the courthouse filled once again for sentencing. The atmosphere was different now. The suspense of guilty or not guilty was gone, replaced by a heavy inevitability. Richard was no longer the sheriff in the minds of the townspeople. He was simply the convicted murderer, stripped of his badge, stripped of his pride. The room was silent as deputies escorted him in, chains clinking softly. He no longer walked with the posture of authority. His shoulders sagged. His eyes were hollow, ringed with sleepless nights. For the first time, Richard Hayes looked like an old man. Judge Morrison presided, his face grim. He gave Richard one final opportunity to speak before sentencing. The entire gallery leaned forward, waiting to hear if the man who had once commanded their town would show remorse. Richard rose slowly, gripping the wooden podium. His voice cracked as he began. I know what I did can't be undone, he said, his gaze flickering toward the front row, where Clarissa's friends sat with tear-streaked faces. I loved her in my way, but when I learned the truth, I lost myself. I saw everything I built, my name, my badge, falling apart, and I panicked. He paused, swallowing hard. I know you see me as a monster. Maybe I am. But I'm also a man who couldn't face being laughed at, couldn't face the humiliation. I let my pride destroy everything. And for that, I will pay. I only pray God has more mercy than I deserve. For a brief moment, the courtroom was silent enough to hear the creak of the benches. Some shook their heads. Others wept. But there was no applause, no forgiveness. The words were too little, too late. Judge Morrison's voice broke the stillness. Richard Hayes, this court has heard your words. But words cannot erase actions. You were entrusted with the power to protect, and instead, you used that power to kill. The law must speak clearly today. For Clarissa Monroe, for this community, and for the very badge you disgraced. The judge leaned forward, his gavel poised. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's knees buckled, his hands gripping the edge of the podium to steady himself. Deputies moved in, taking him by the arms. He didn't resist. His eyes closed as if the weight of the words finally crushed what little spirit remained. As he was led away, Clarissa's friends clutched one another, tears streaming down their faces. For them, the sentence was not triumph but bittersweet relief. Justice had been spoken, but nothing could bring Clarissa back. Outside, reporters broadcast a moment to the world. Former Sheriff Richard Hayes has been sentenced to life in prison. One anchor declared into the camera. The case has rocked this Georgia town and sparked national debate over pride, prejudice, and the price of secrets. Back inside, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Detective Marcus Hill lingered. He looked at the empty chair where Clarissa should have been, the space she once filled with her laughter and grace. He knew justice had been done, but the victory tasted hollow. Too many lives had been broken, too many hearts shattered. For the people of Willow Creek, the sentence marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. The story of how a community rebuilds after learning its protector was capable of murder. And for Richard Hayes, the once proud sheriff, the rest of his life would unfold behind cold steel bars, haunted not by the whispers of his town, but by the silence of the woman whose love he had destroyed. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, Willow Creek struggled to find its balance again. The town that once wrapped itself in tradition and small-town pride was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Porch conversations turned quiet. Church sermons carried heavier tones, and in the diner where Richard Hayes had once been greeted with nods and respect, the air now buzzed with sorrow and shame. On a warm Sunday evening, the townspeople gathered in the square for a candlelight vigil in Clarissa's honor. Dozens of candles flickered in the dark, their flames reflecting off tearful faces. Friends spoke of her laughter, of the way she brightened every room she entered, of the kindness she offered to people who needed it most. A framed photo of Clarissa sat in the center, her smile radiant, her eyes alive with warmth. She deserved love, one woman said through sobs. She deserved safety. She deserved the truth of who she was to be met with acceptance, not violence. As the crowd bowed their heads in silence, it was clear that Clarissa's life had left a mark deeper than anyone realized. Her story became not just a tragedy, but a mirror held up to the community, forcing them to see the cost of silence, of prejudice, of pride. Detective Marcus Hill stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, hands folded. He had seen countless murders in his career, but this case clung to him in a way others hadn't, because Clarissa's death wasn't just about a gun and a trigger. It was about fear, about identity, about a man so consumed by what others thought him that he destroyed the one person who loved him most. Justice has been done, Marcus whispered under his breath, but it doesn't feel like victory. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes began his life sentence in a concrete cell. Gone were the parades, the uniforms, the polished badge. His days were measured by prison bells and the echo of steel doors. In the yard, inmates whispered his name, some mocking, some curious. The sheriff had become the prisoner. At night, lying on the thin cot under the harsh fluorescent lights, Richard replayed that night over and over. The candles, the music, the tears in Clarissa's eyes, the sound of the gunshot. His pride had been his undoing, and now it was all he had left, an empty, bitter companion that gnawed at him in silence. He tried to pray, but the words stuck in his throat. He tried to sleep, but her voice came back to him in dreams. "I'm your wife. I've always loved you." He would wake with a start, sweat dripping down his face, his hands trembling as if the gun was still there. For Willow Creek, life moved forward, but not untouched. The case became a cautionary tale. Parents spoke more carefully to their children about acceptance. Churches debated sermons on compassion versus judgment. And while some clung to belief that Richard had been betrayed, others recognized that Clarissa's death was the product of something larger, a culture that prized reputation over truth, image over love. Years later, a small plaque was placed near the town square, inscribed with her name. Clarissa Monroe, remembered for her light, her laughter, and her courage to be herself. People left flowers there, not just in mourning, but in recognition, a quiet promise that her life would not be forgotten. In the end, the story of Sheriff Richard Hayes was not the story of a lawman undone by betrayal. It was the story of a woman who lived bravely with her truth, and of a town forced to reckon with the consequences of its silence. Clarissa's legacy was not in the way she died, but in the way her life challenged others to see beyond appearances, to confront prejudice, and understand that love is never deception. And for Richard, the sheriff turned inmate, the rest of his days were a sentence not just of prison walls, but of memory, haunted by the truth he could not bear, and by the love he destroyed in a single, irreversible act. Years later, long after the headlines had faded and the courthouse whispers had quieted, Detective Marcus Hill, now retired, his hair fully gray, found himself standing in front of the small plaque in the town square. The evening sun dipped low, painting the metal plate with a golden glow. He reached out and brushed his fingers lightly over Clarissa's name. Around him, the town bustled as usual, children riding bikes, church bells ringing, but Marcus felt a weight of silence in his chest. "We failed you," he murmured. "All of us. But we remember." He lingered for a moment longer, then left a single white flower at the base of the plaque before turning away. In his heart, he knew Clarissa's story would never leave him. It wasn't just a case. It was a lesson carved into the soul of Willow Creek, that pride kills, silence wounds, and truth, though fragile, is worth protecting.